Well, good evening. Welcome. My name is Mark Sterling. I am involved in helping to lead Trinity, which is one of the local churches here in St Andrews. And it's our pleasure to host this event this evening. It's a special pleasure to welcome Dr. William Lane Craig, who is our guest lecturer this evening. Bill is a research professor of philosophy at Biola in Southern California. He holds 2 doctoral degrees, as though one were not enough. One from the University of Birmingham, that's Birmingham, England, and one from Munich. He has published extensively, both at a popular level and also extensively in peer-reviewed academic journals. Dr. Craig is perhaps best known for public debating and publicly debating some of the leading atheists of the day. And if you search for him on Google or on YouTube, you will see multiple clips of some of those debates. If that whets your appetite, or if this evening whets your appetite, there's a website called, which is reasonablefaith.org, where if you have questions, if there's things you'd like to follow up, then that's a great resource to go to that website. There are both written resources for you to read, also podcasts if you have particular things you'd like to find out more about or questions that you have. The format of this evening will be, first of all, that Dr. Craig will deliver this lecture with the title, Is the Material World All There Is? And then after that, there will be plenty of time for question and answer. So if you have any questions, then there will be an opportunity at that point to ask those. Please keep those questions and keep them in mind for whenever the lecture is finished. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Craig, and one of you join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you very much. Mark did mention that what brings me to St Andrews this week is the opportunity to lecture at a philosophy of physics conference that was held in this very room yesterday by the university. I was very grateful for the invitation from St Andrews to participate in that conference. It was very extraordinary, just a wonderful exchange of stimulating ideas in the philosophy of physics today. And so, being in town, Mark and others decided to piggyback on that visit by holding this public lecture this evening, which I was only too glad to do so. It's wonderful to be back in the land of my forebears. Craig is Scottish, as you know, and that's where my descendants were from. And so I have enjoyed being here. I've never been in St Andrews before, and have really enjoyed the couple of days that we've been here, including visiting the famous golf club that we've so often seen on television. So thank you for coming tonight, and I look forward to our discussion together. The question that I want to explore with you this evening is the material world all there is? The view that there is nothing apart from the material world goes by a number of different names. Materialism, physicalism, naturalism, to name a few. David Armstrong, who is a prominent naturalistic philosopher, characterizes naturalism in the following way. He says, naturalism is the doctrine that reality consists of nothing but a single, all-embracing, spatio-temporal system. According to this view, then, all that exists is the physical contents of space and time. Now, the question before us this evening is that true? Is there nothing but the physical objects existing in time and space? Tonight, I want to look at some reasons to think that that may not be the case. I believe that there are certain aspects of reality that we encounter in our experience of the world that suggest that the physical world is not all there is. These serve, as it were, as signposts of transcendence, pointing beyond the physical world to its ground in a transcendent reality. And apart from some overriding reason to think that naturalism is true, I think we have to be open, at least, to the possibility of such a transcendent reality. We can't justifiably close our minds in advance to the existence of such a reality. As Shakespeare's Hamlet put it, there may be more things in heaven and on earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Tonight I want to sketch 7 aspects of the world which suggest that there are indeed more things in heaven and on earth than are dreamt of in naturalistic philosophy. Now, whole books have been written on each one of these, so in the brief time that we have together, I can only sketch each aspect for you. And during the Q&A following my talk, we can go into any of these in greater depth that you might care to discuss. So, number 1, then, is why anything at all exists. This is the deepest question of philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? In his biography of the great Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, Norman Malcolm reports, Wittgenstein said that he sometimes had a certain experience which could best be described by saying that when I have it, I wonder at the existence of the world. I am then inclined to use such phrases as how extraordinary that anything should exist, or how extraordinary that the world should exist. This mystery, which according to Aristotle lay at the very root of philosophy, is one which thoughtful naturalists cannot avoid. Derek Parfit, for example, agrees that no question is more sublime than why there is a universe, why there is anything rather than nothing. Now, experience teaches that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. This principle seems quite plausible, at least more so than it's contradictory. Imagine that you were walking across a heath and came upon a translucent ball lying on the ground. You would naturally wonder how it came to be there. If your walking partner said to you, "Forget about it, it just exists inexplicably," you would regard that claim as quite bizarre and probably figure that he just wanted you to keep moving. But you wouldn't take seriously the idea that the ball literally has no explanation for its existence. And notice that merely increasing the size of the ball, even until it becomes coextensive with the cosmos, would do nothing to provide or eliminate the need for an explanation of its existence. According to this first principle, then, everything that exists is one of 2 types. The first type is something that exists necessarily by its own nature. Examples? Well, many mathematicians believe that numbers, sets, and other mathematical objects exist in this way. If such entities exist, they just exist necessarily, without any external cause of their being. The other type is anything that has an external cause of its existence. Examples? Mountains, planets, galaxies, people. They have causes outside of themselves which explain why they exist. Now, it's obvious that, too, the universe exists. It therefore follows logically that the universe has an explanation of its existence. Now, some philosophers have said that the universe should be an exception to the principle that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. But why do they think this? Well, because they say the explanation for any physical state of affairs, S, must be found in a causally prior state of affairs in which S does not yet exist. For example, the explanation why a certain horse exists is that two other horses were bred with the result that they caused the new horse to be conceived and come into existence. Now, apply this principle to the universe. Any explanation of why the universe exists must be found in a causally prior state in which the universe does not yet exist. But these philosophers object that state of affairs would be a state of nothingness, since the universe is all there is. And since nothing can't be the cause of anything, it's absurd to demand an explanation of the existence of the universe. So the first premise doesn't apply to the universe. The universe cannot have an explanation of its existence. This objection, however, pretty plainly begs the question in favor of naturalism, for it assumes in advance that the universe is all there is, or in other words, that naturalism is true. So the objector is reasoning in a circle. Why should we think that the state of affairs causally prior to the existence of the universe has to be a physical state of affairs? The explanation of why the universe exists could be some causally prior, non-physical state of affairs. And if you assume that that's impossible, then you're just begging the question in favor of naturalism. So, what sort of explanation could the universe have? Well, it seems plausible that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is an external, transcendent, personal cause. Why? Because the cause of the universe must be greater than the universe. Now think of the universe. All of space and time and their contents. So the cause of the universe must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. Now, what sort of entity could that be? Well, there are only two possible candidates that I know of that could fit such a description. Either abstract objects, like numbers, or else an unembodied mind, or consciousness. But you see, abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of the definition of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, can't cause anything. It has no effects. And therefore, it follows logically that therefore, the explanation of the universe is an external, transcendent, personal cause. That is to say, there exists an unembodied mind which created the universe, which is what people have traditionally meant by the word God. Now, what can the naturalist say in response to this argument? Well, he could say, all right, the universe does have an explanation of its existence, but that explanation does not lie in an external cause, but rather in the necessity of its own nature. Like numbers and other mathematical objects, the universe exists necessarily. This, however, is a pretty bold speculation which naturalists have not been eager to embrace. We have a strong sense, I think, of the contingency of the universe. We can conceive of a possible world in which no concrete objects at all exist. For example, a world in which only mathematical objects exist. Why should we think that such a world is impossible? Moreover, I think there are good reasons for thinking that the universe does not exist by a necessity of its own nature. It's easy to conceive of the non-existence of any and all of the objects that we observe in the world. Indeed, at one point in the past, when the universe was very dense and very hot, none of these objects did exist. But what about the fundamental particles, or the building blocks of matter, like quarks? Well, it's easy to conceive of a world in which all of the fundamental particles composing some macroscopic object were replaced by other quarks. A universe consisting of a totally different collection of quarks, for example, seems quite possible. But if that's the case, then the universe does not exist by a necessity of its own nature. For a universe composed of a different collection of quarks would be a different universe, not the same universe as ours. To illustrate, just ask yourself, could the shoes that you are wearing have been made of steel? Now, certainly, we can imagine that you had a pair of shoes which were the same size and shape as the shoes you're wearing, but were made of steel. But that's not the question we're asking. We're asking whether the very shoes you're wearing, whether those shoes could have been made of steel. I think the answer is obviously not. They would be a different pair of shoes. And the same is true of the universe. If it were composed of a different collection of quarks, different matter, then it would be a different universe, not the same universe. No naturalist will, I think, dare to suggest that some quarks, though looking for all the world like ordinary quarks, have the special occult property of being necessary in their existence, so that any universe that exists would have to include these quarks. It's all or nothing here. But nobody thinks that every quark in the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. And it then follows that the universe does not exist by a necessity of its own nature either. So it seems to me that this is a sound argument for thinking that the best explanation for why anything at all exists is to be found in a personal, transcendent mind, which is necessary in its existence and which is the cause of the contingent universe. Number two, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Was there a beginning to the universe? Or has it just existed from eternity? Can you just go back and back and back forever and never come to a beginning? Typically, naturalists have said that the universe is just eternal, and that's all. But there are good reasons, I think, both philosophical and scientific, to doubt that this is the case. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past seems very problematic, even absurd, I would say. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of events in the past history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. For example, suppose you had an actually infinite number of coins, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity. And suppose that I took away all of the odd-numbered coins. How many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even-numbered coins. Or in other words, an infinity of coins. So, infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead of taking away all of the odd-numbered coins, I took away all of the coins numbered greater than 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, out to infinity. Now how many coins would you have left? Well, just 3. So, infinity minus infinity is 3. And yet in each case I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with non-identical, self-contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any number from 0 to infinity. This shows, I think, that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. David Hilbert, who was perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, wrote, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." But that entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. And therefore the series of past events can't go back and back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 13 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event called the Big Bang. And what makes the Big Bang so startling is that it represents the origin not only of all the matter and energy in the universe, but even of physical space and time themselves. As the physicist P.C.W. Davies explains, and I quote, "The coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing," end quote. Now, of course, alternative theories have been crafted over the years to try to avoid this absolute beginning. But none of these theories has commended itself to the scientific community as more plausible than theories involving an absolute beginning. In fact, in 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. Earlier this year, at a conference at Cambridge University, celebrating the 70th birthday of Stephen Hawking, Vilenkin delivered a paper entitled, "Did the Universe Have a Beginning?" in which he surveyed current cosmology with respect to that question. And he argued, and I quote, that none of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. He concluded, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. Now, that's a remarkable statement. Vilenkin did not say merely that the evidence for a beginning outweighs the evidence against a beginning. Rather, he says, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. There is no evidence that the universe is beginningless. Vilenkin pulls no punches. He writes, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." End quote. That problem was nicely captured by Sir Anthony Kinney of Oxford University. He writes, "A proponent of the Big Bang theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing." Now, Kenny was speaking of the standard Big Bang model, but his conclusion applies with equal force to non-standard models as well. The difficulty is that such a conclusion that the universe came from nothing and by nothing is, in the words of the philosopher of science Contingency, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. So, why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been some sort of cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize our reasoning thus far as follows. 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion follows necessarily by the laws of logic. But what sort of cause could this be? Well, from the very nature of the case, if what I've said is correct, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, immaterial being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. So we must come to an absolutely first, uncaused cause. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore it cannot be material or physical. Moreover, I would argue this cause must also plausibly be personal. Just ask yourself the question, how else could a timeless cause give rise to a temporal effect like the universe? If the cause were a mechanically operating set of necessary and sufficient conditions, then the cause could never exist without its effect. But let me illustrate the point. The cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees centigrade. Now, if the temperature were below 0 degrees from eternity past, then any water that was around would be frozen from eternity. It would be impossible for the water just to begin to freeze a finite time ago. So if the cause is permanently present, then the effect should be permanently present as well. So in the case of the universe, how can the cause be timeless and yet its effect only begin to exist a finite time ago? Well, it seems to me that there's only one way out of this dilemma, and that is if the cause is a personal agent endowed with freedom of the will, who can therefore create an effect in time spontaneously without any prior determining conditions. For example, a man who has been sitting from eternity could freely will to stand up. And so you would have a temporal effect with a beginning arise from an eternal cause. And thus we are brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number 3, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. During the last 50 years or so, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the existence of intelligent, interactive life depends upon a complex and delicate balance of initial conditions given in the Big Bang itself. Scientists once believed that whatever the initial conditions of the universe might have been, eventually intelligent life might evolve somewhere in the cosmos. But in fact, we now know that our existence is balanced on a knife's edge. The existence of intelligent life anywhere in the universe depends upon a conspiracy of initial conditions given in the Big Bang, which must be fine-tuned to a degree that is literally incomprehensible and incalculable. This fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are given mathematical expression as equations, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. These constants are not determined by the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values of these constants. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities which are simply put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature then operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the early universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were any one of these constants or quantities to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. For example, P.C.W. Davies has calculated that a change in the strength of the atomic weak force by as little as 1 part out of 10 to the 100th power would have prevented a life-permitting universe. The cosmological constant, which drives the inflationary expansion of the universe and is responsible for the recently discovered acceleration of the universe's expansion, is inexplicably fine-tuned to 1 part out of 10 to the 120th power. Roger Penrose of Oxford University has calculated that the odds of the Big Bang's initial low entropy condition existing by chance alone are somewhere on the order of 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. A number which is so inconceivable that to call it astronomical would be a wild understatement. Penrose comments, "I cannot even recall seeing anything else in physics whose accuracy is known to approach even remotely a figure like 1 part in 10 to the 10th to the 123rd. And it's not just each quantity and constant that must be finely tuned. Their ratios to one another must also be exquisitely fine-tuned. So improbability is multiplied by improbability until our minds are reeling in incomprehensible numbers." Now, there are 3 possible explanations discussed in the literature for explaining the presence of this remarkable fine-tuning of the universe: physical necessity, chance, or design. The first alternative, physical necessity, holds that there is some unknown theory of everything, or TOE, T-O-E, which would explain why the universe is the way it is. It had to be that way, and there was really no chance, or little chance, of the universe's not being life-permitting. By contrast, the second alternative, chance, states that the fine-tuning of the universe is due entirely to chance. It's just an accident that the universe is life-permitting, and we're the lucky beneficiaries. The third alternative rejects both of these accounts in favor of an intelligent mind behind the cosmos who designed the universe to permit life. And the question is, which of these 3 alternatives is the most plausible explanation? Well, the first alternative seems extraordinarily implausible because, as we've seen, the constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values of these constants and quantities. For example, the most promising candidate for a TOE to date, superstring theory, or so-called M theory, allows a cosmic landscape of around 10 to the 500th power different universes governed by the present laws of nature, but with different values of the fundamental constants, so that the theory does nothing to explain the observed values of the constants and quantities that we see as to render them physically necessary. So what about the second alternative? That the fine-tuning of the universe is due to chance. The problem with this alternative is that the odds against the universe's being life-permitting are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be reasonably faced. Even though there may be a huge number of universes in the cosmic landscape which are life-permitting, nevertheless, the proportion of life-permitting worlds to the landscape as a whole will be unfathomably tiny, so that a dart thrown randomly at the landscape would have no meaningful chance of striking a life-permitting world. So, in order to rescue the hypothesis of chance, its proponents have been forced to adopt the extraordinary hypothesis that there exists an infinite number of randomly ordered parallel universes composing a sort of world ensemble or multiverse of which our universe is but a part. Somewhere in this infinite world ensemble, finely tuned universes will appear by chance alone, and we happen to be in one such world. There are, however, at least two major weaknesses of the world ensemble hypothesis. First, there's no independent evidence that such a world ensemble exists. No one knows if there are other universes at all, much less that they are randomly ordered and infinite in number. Moreover, recall that Bohr, Guth, and Vilenkin proved that any universe which is in a state of continuous cosmic expansion cannot be infinite in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. Their theorem also applies to the multiverse, and therefore the multiverse itself can only have a finite past. Since its past is merely finite, that means that only a finite number of other universes may have been generated by now in the world ensemble, so that there's no guarantee that a finely tuned universe will have yet appeared anywhere in the ensemble. Secondly, and more fundamentally, if our universe is just a random member of an infinite world ensemble, then it is overwhelmingly more probable that we should be observing a much different universe than what we in fact observe. Roger Penrose has calculated that it is inconceivably more probable that our solar system should suddenly form by the random collision of particles than that a finely tuned universe should exist. Penrose, in fact, calls it utter chicken feed by comparison. So, if our universe were just a random member of a world ensemble, it is inconceivably more probable that we should be observing an island of order no larger than our solar system. For there are far more observable universes in the world ensemble in which our solar system suddenly forms in an instant by the random collision of particles than universes that are finely tuned for intelligent, interactive life. Or again, if our universe were just a random member of a world ensemble, then we ought to be observing highly extraordinary events like horses popping in and out of existence through the random collision of particles, because such events are vastly more probable than all of nature's constants and quantities falling by chance into the virtually infinitesimal life-permitting range. Indeed, the most probable observable universe is one in which a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the quantum vacuum and observes its otherwise empty world. observable universes like that are just much, much more plenteous in the world ensemble than worlds like ours, and therefore ought to be observed by us. Since we do not have such observations, that fact strongly disconfirms the world ensemble hypothesis. On naturalism, at least, therefore, it is highly probable that there is no such world ensemble. But then it seems that, too, the fine-tuning is not plausibly due to physical necessity or to chance, from which it follows logically, therefore, it is due to design. Therefore, we ought to prefer the design hypothesis, unless the design hypothesis can be shown to be just as implausible as its rivals. And detractors of design sometimes do object to the design hypothesis. For example, that on this hypothesis, the cosmic designer remains himself unexplained. It's said that an intelligent mind also exhibits complex order, so that if the universe needs an explanation, then so does its designer. And if its designer does not need an explanation, well, then why think that the universe does? This objection, however, is based upon a misconception of the nature of explanation. It's widely recognized by philosophers of science that in order for an explanation to be the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. For example, if astronauts were to find a pile of machinery on the dark side of the moon, they would recognize that it was the product of intelligent design, even if they had no explanation whatsoever of who made it or how it came to be there. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. In fact, when you think about it, such a requirement would immediately lead to an infinite regress of explanations, so that nothing could ever be explained, and science would be destroyed. For before any explanation would be acceptable, you'd need an explanation of the explanation. But before you could accept the explanation of the explanation, you need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation. And before you could accept that, you would need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on. Nothing could ever be explained. So, in the case at hand, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. Whether the designer has an explanation can simply be left an open question for future inquiry. Moreover, notice that the complexity of a mind is not really analogous to the complexity of the universe. A mind's ideas may be complex, but a mind itself is a remarkable, simple thing, being an immaterial entity, not composed of separable parts or pieces. Moreover, properties like intelligence, consciousness, and volition are not contingent properties, which a mind might lack. They're essential to the nature of a mind. And so postulating an uncreated mind behind the cosmos is not at all like postulating an undesigned cosmos with all of its contingent and variegated quantities and constants. Number 4, objective moral values and duties in the world. If naturalism is true, then it's plausible that objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, to say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or bad, right or wrong, independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. It's to say, for example, that Nazi anti-Semitism was morally wrong, even though the Nazis who carried out the Holocaust thought that it was morally good. And it would still have been wrong, even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everyone who disagreed with them, so that everyone thought that the Holocaust was good. And the claim is that in the absence of God, to serve as a transcendent anchor for moral values and duties are not objective in that sense. So, premise one, if God does not exist, it's plausible that objective moral values and duties would not exist. And many atheists and theists alike concur on this point. For example, the late J.L. Mackie of Oxford University, who was one of the most influential atheists of our time, admitted, and I quote, "If there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more plausible than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of a God," end quote. But instead of inferring God's existence, Mackie denied that objective moral values exist. He wrote, "It is easy to explain this moral sense as a natural product of biological and social evolution." Michael Roos, a Canadian philosopher of science, agrees. He explains, "Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." Friedrich Nietzsche, the great 19th century atheist who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I certainly think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? And like Mackie and Roos, I frankly just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality evolved by Homo sapiens on this planet is objectively true. After all, given a naturalistic view, what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the naturalistic view, some action, say rape, may not be socially advantageous, at least among human beings, and so in the course of human evolution has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the naturalistic view, apart from the social consequences, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. And thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong which imposes itself on our conscience. But the problem is that two objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world about us. Just as in the absence of some defeater, we are rational to trust the deliverances of our senses, that there is a world of physical objects out there, so in the absence of some defeater, we are rational to trust the deliverances of our moral apprehensions. And there is no such defeater. The reasoning of Michael Ruse at best proves only that our subjective perception of moral values has evolved. But if moral values are gradually discovered rather than gradually invented, then our gradual and fallible apprehension of the moral realm no more undermines the objective reality of that realm than our gradual and fallible apprehension of the physical world undermines the objectivity of that realm. As the philosopher Louise Antony so nicely put it in our debate on the foundations of morality, any argument for moral skepticism is going to be based upon premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values and duties themselves, and so could never be rational to accept. And surely we do apprehend such objective values and duties. Actions like rape, torture, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior, they're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Michael Ruse himself confesses in another context, and I quote, "The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Notice that Ruse here ascribes to moral truths the same sort of logical necessity that characterizes mathematical truths of elementary arithmetic. But if objective moral values and duties cannot exist without God, and objective moral values and duties do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. And thus I think this provides good moral grounds for belief in God's existence. Number 5, the very possibility of God's existence. I've rarely shared this argument in public talks or debates, not because I think it's unsound, but because it's so abstract that students who hear it are apt to think either that it's some kind of a trick or else not understand it at all. But tonight I'm going to take a chance and share it with you. Now, in order to understand this argument, you need to understand what philosophers mean by possible worlds. A possible world is just a way the world might have been. It's a complete description of reality. So a possible world is not a planet or a universe or any kind of concrete object. It's just a world description. The actual world is the description that is true. Other possible worlds are descriptions that are not in fact true, but which might have been true. To say that something exists in some possible world is just to say that there is some possible description of reality which includes that entity. To say that something exists in every possible world means that no matter which description is true, the entity will be included in the description. So, for example, unicorns do not in fact exist, but there is some possible world in which unicorns exist. On the other hand, many mathematicians think that numbers exist in every possible world. Now, with that in mind, consider the ontological argument, which was discovered in the year 1011 by the monk Anselm of Canterbury. God, Anselm observes, is by definition the greatest being conceivable. If you could conceive of anything greater than God, then that would be God. by the very definition, God is the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So what would such a being be like? Well, he would be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, and he would exist in every logically possible world. A being which lacked any of those properties would not be maximally great. We could conceive of something greater. But what that implies is that if God's existence is even possible, then God must exist. For if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, he exists in all of them. That's part of what it means to be maximally great, to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good in every logically possible world. So if God's existence is even possible, it follows that he exists in every logically possible world, and therefore in the actual world. We can summarize this argument as follows. 1. It's possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists. 2. If it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5. Therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. 6. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. 7. Therefore, God exists. Now, it might surprise you to learn that steps 2 to 7 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers would agree that if God's existence is even possible, then he must exist. So the whole question comes down to premise 1. Is God's existence possible? Well, what do you think? The atheist has to maintain that it's impossible that God exists. He has to say that the concept of God is incoherent, like the concept of a married bachelor or a round square. But the problem is that the concept of God just doesn't appear to be incoherent in that way. The idea of a being which is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good in every logically possible world seems perfectly coherent. Moreover, as we've already seen, there are other arguments for God's existence which at least suggest that it's possible that God exists. So I will simply leave it to you tonight. Do you think, as I do, that it's at least possible that God exists? Well, if you do, then it follows logically that he does exist. Number 6, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was by all accounts a remarkable individual. New Testament historians have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. That's why the Jewish leadership instigated his crucifixion on the charge of blasphemy. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come, and as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and hence evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people would probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But there are actually 3 established facts which are recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Namely, his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Let me say a brief word about each one of these. Fact number one, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. According to Jakob Kramer, who is an Austrian scholar who specialized in the study of the resurrection narratives, and I quote, "By far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb," end quote. According to D.H. Van Dalen, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it, he says, do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Fact number two, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus after his death. According to Gerd Ludemann, a prominent German New Testament critic, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain," those are his words, not mine, "as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ," end quote. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by unbelievers, skeptics, and even enemies. Fact number three, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation confronting the disciples following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic expectations included no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. Two, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to go to their deaths for the truth of that belief. Luke Johnson, who is a New Testament scholar at Emory University, says some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement early Christianity was. And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar here at St. Andrews University, has said, "That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him." Attempts to explain away these three great facts naturalistically, like the disciples stole the body, or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and therefore was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. We can summarize this argument as follows. One, there are three established facts concerning the fate of Jesus of Nazareth: the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of his disciples' belief in his resurrection. Two, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead is the best explanation of these facts. Three, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead entails that the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists. Four, therefore, the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God from Jesus' resurrection. Finally, number 7, the personal experience of God. This last point isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by personally experiencing Him. This was the way that people in the Bible knew God. As Professor John Hick of the University of Birmingham explains, God was known to them as a dynamic will interacting with their own wills, a sheer given reality, as inescapably to be reckoned with as destructive storm and life-giving sunshine. They did not think of God as an inferred entity, but as an experienced reality. To them, God was not the conclusion of a syllogism or an idea adopted by the mind, but an experiential reality which gave significance to their lives. End quote. Philosophers call beliefs like this properly basic beliefs. They aren't based on some other beliefs. Rather, they're part of a person's foundational beliefs for his system of beliefs. Other properly basic beliefs would be the belief in the reality of the past, the existence of the external world, and the presence of other minds like your own. When you think about it, none of these beliefs can be proved by argument. How could you prove that the world was not created 5 minutes ago with built-in traces of age? Food in our stomachs from the suppers we never really ate, and memory traces in our brains of events we never really experienced. How could you prove that you're not a brain in a vat of chemicals wired up with electrodes and being stimulated by a mad scientist to make you believe that you're here in this lecture hall listening to this lecture this evening? How can you prove that other people around you are not really androids who exhibit all of the external behavior of persons with minds, when in fact they are really soulless, robot-like entities? We don't base such beliefs on argument. Rather, they are part of the foundations of a person's system of belief. But although these sorts of beliefs are basic for us, that doesn't mean that they're arbitrary. Rather, they're grounded in the sense that they are formed in the context of certain experiences. In the experiential context of seeing and hearing and feeling certain things, I naturally form the belief that there are certain physical objects around me which I am sensing. And thus my basic beliefs are not arbitrary, but they are appropriately grounded in experience. There may be no way to prove such beliefs are true, and yet it's perfectly rational to hold them. You'd have to be crazy to think that the world was created 5 minutes ago, or that you were really a brain in a vat. Such beliefs are thus not merely basic, but they are properly basic. Now, in exactly the same way, belief in God is for those who experience Him a properly basic belief grounded in our experience of God. And we can summarize this consideration as follows. 1. Beliefs which are appropriately grounded may be rationally accepted as basic beliefs, not grounded on argument. 2. Belief that the biblical God exists is appropriately grounded. 3. Therefore, belief that the biblical God exists may be accepted as a basic belief not grounded on argument. Now, if this is right, then there's a real danger that arguments for the existence of God could actually distract your attention from God Himself. We mustn't so focus on the external arguments that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. We mustn't so focus on the external proofs that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God can become a personal reality in their lives. So, in summary then, we've seen 7 features of the world around us which point beyond the world to its ground in a transcendent reality. 1, why anything at all exists. 2, the origin of the universe. 3, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. 4, the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world. 5, the very possibility of God's existence. 6, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And 7, the personal experience of God. Is the material world all there is? Well, I think that taken together, these 7 signposts of transcendence constitute a powerful cumulative case suggesting that the answer is no. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions or discussion that anyone might like to raise?
Thank you, Bill. I wonder if anyone else feels like they've just had a vigorous mental workout and their heads are hurting. Questions? We'll have somebody who will circulate with the microphone, so please wait so you get the microphone in front of you before asking a question. And I have somebody who's going to run with the microphone for me. Where are they? Yes. Good. Beautiful assistant. There you go. Okay, so you were the first hand there, just in about the 5th row back there.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and quite literally all-encompassing lecture. Very stimulating. In the ontological argument you used for the existence of God based on the possibility of there being a God,
Yes.
could that argument not also be used by atheists for the existence of the universe? Namely, that because the laws of mathematics permit the existence of the universe, therefore a licensing universe must exist.
I thought you were going to go in a quite different direction with your question. I don't see how this could be run using the universe unless you already think that the universe is a being or a thing that exists by a necessity of its own nature. And you remember I addressed that when we talked about the contingency argument. So no one needs to argue from the possibility of the universe to its existence. We already know the universe exists. So there just wouldn't be anything comparable to this. If the naturalist does think the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature, he won't go with the ontological argument. He'll attempt to deny the contingency argument in the way that I suggested.
Thank you.
Next one is just up. You want to run around between.
While she goes there, let me comment that your remark about the all-encompassing nature of this is one of the features of theism that I find so attractive. It explains a wide range of the data of human experience. Philosophical, scientific, ethical, historical. This is one of the things that makes the theistic hypothesis so powerful, is its explanatory scope. And I haven't even dealt with everything. For example, I didn't talk about consciousness tonight and the best explanation for mental states. That's another argument entirely. Yes?
Thank you very much. Personally, I find the ontological argument very convincing, but I want to raise an objection against your argument from objective moral facts.
All right.
I would like to say, suppose moral values, objective moral values, could derive objectivity by free agents adopting them.
By what?
By free agents, like you or I adopting them. Suppose when I say X is wrong, what I mean is I disapprove of X.
Yes.
Well, it is objectively true that I disapprove of X, and therefore objectively true that X is wrong. Would you not have to show that objectively moral values apply to things which are not free agents?
I think that what you've just suggested is a paradigm example of subjective moral values and duties. You've said that this is wrong because I think so, but it doesn't follow from that that therefore it is objectively wrong. It is objectively true that you think it's wrong. That's an objective truth. It's an objective truth that you think it's wrong, but it doesn't follow from that that therefore it's objectively wrong. Indeed, it's dependent upon you. You made it up. And remember, the definition I gave is that these values and duties are binding and valid independent of whether anybody believes in them or not, whether you had ever existed. So I think what you've given is a paradigm example of subjective moral values and duties. Okay, someone else?
Just further along the same row. And maybe we can just queue up another couple as well.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for that lecture. Great. Just again on moral arguments. So you mentioned about that. So some people would say that it's an objective truth, moral truth, and that people would disagree with rape and child abuse and that sort of thing. But in terms of what people could argue against that is that from a biological point of view is could the people that sort of carry out those actions say almost be I don't know how to word it, rejects of the animal kingdom, so like a mongrel, would they carry those out because they don't actually want to follow the sort of biological concepts around, do you know what I mean? In terms of,
Yes, I think so.
So could they sort of argue that people that carry out such actions that we see as objective moral truths or against that, could they be rejects of the animal kingdom? Could they say that? That's the point. Sorry, not really to explain.
Well, if I understand your question, it seems to me that you're enunciating precisely the point of view that Michael Roos explained, namely that the moral values that Homo sapiens have adopted are the result of evolutionary and social pressures that are useful for the survival of our herd. And those who are antisocial or pathological get rejected or outside of society, and so their views don't win out. And as I say, if God does not exist in premise one, it seems to me that's absolutely right. That's what moral values and duties are. They're just spin-offs of the biological and social evolutionary process. But, as I said in my talk, that's not an objection against premise 2, that objective moral values and duties exist. Because if moral values and duties are gradually discovered, rather than gradually invented, then the fact that what we believe is the product of socio-biological pressures has nothing to do at all with their objective reality. To think so would be to commit what philosophers call the genetic fallacy, which is trying to invalidate a position by showing how someone came to believe it. So, for example, saying, well, your belief in democratic government is no good or false because the only reason you believe that is because you were raised in England or in a democratic society. That commits the genetic fallacy. Regardless of how you came to hold the belief that you hold, it says nothing against the truth or falsity of that. And so this line of reasoning which says, well, what we believe is just the result of socio-biological pressures and the outcast doesn't survive and so forth, that commits the genetic fallacy if that is meant to be an objection to premise 2.
Thank you.
Just third row back here, down on the right, and then we'll come back up to our left here.
Hi, just to clear you, at the very start we actually used David Armstrong's definition of naturalism.
True.
I'm just interested to hear how you would respond to somebody like Galen Strawson, who would argue that David Armstrong has absolutely no right to make that claim about naturalism since he does not understand all the features of what naturalism actually is and what
Yes.
materialism is. He would argue for something that he calls real materialism, which is something completely more.
Well, the type of naturalism against which I was arguing tonight is the type as defined by David Armstrong. But as was very evident in our conference in this room yesterday, there is no agreement among secular philosophers as to what naturalism even means. Naturalists themselves can't seem to decide on what naturalism is. So what I've done is just select the version of naturalism that I think is an interesting question and ask, is that version of naturalism true? And if you can think of some version of naturalism that is compatible with the conclusions of my 7 arguments, well, then I don't have any objection to that kind of naturalism, at least not tonight anyway. There might be some other problems with it. I've got to be more cautious. Yes?
Can I go on to number 6? Is that not easily defeated? That was the resurrection of Jesus, historical facts.
Yeah.
And your 3 established facts. Is that whole argument not defeated just simply by stating Jesus didn't exist?
It's not defeated because the person would have to show that there's more evidence for the proposition Jesus didn't exist than for proposition 1. And there is no evidence for that proposition. And if you're interested in looking at this, there's a recent book by Bart Ehrman, who is not a Christian. He's not even a theist. He is an agnostic, New Testament historian, and he's just written a book called Did Jesus Exist?, in which he goes after so-called mythicists who claim that Jesus of Nazareth never existed. And he just takes them apart mercilessly and shows how they don't understand historical method. They're making all sorts of unwarranted inferences and ignoring the evidence. And it's a very powerful demonstration of the fact that Jesus of Nazareth existed. So the person who asserts that has got a lot of explaining to do. He's got to show that that belief is better justified in light of the evidence in premise 1. And no historian thinks that that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun watching American atheists rip themselves to shreds arguing about whether Jesus exists or not, but I think it's, at a popular level, the argument carries a lot of weight because we live in a postmodern, ahistorical society where it's now a very common thing. I mean, when I was in school, nobody really argued that Jesus didn't exist. Now you get, in popular culture, you'll get plenty of people who argue.
Yes, I realize that this ridiculous movie, Zeitgeist, that is all over the internet, kind of a cult movie, that claims that Christianity is derived from sun god worship of Horus in Egypt. This is all over the internet, and it's just hopelessly irresponsible in light of historical scholarship. A good article to recommend on that particular subject is by Mark Foreman in the book Contending with Christianity's Critics that Paul Copan and I edited. It's a very funny article in which Mark examines the claims of these modern mythicists and again just exposes them for the embarrassment really that they are. It's quite funny. So either Foreman's article or again Bart Ehrman's book is really good from a non-biased source. And you're right, these are prevalent in popular culture, but that's no reason that we should go along with it. We need to correct those mistakes.
Hi, I would like to mention in the moral argument you seem to make a presumption on presume one of the sides of the first element that morality is therefore contingent upon God. What do you think of the counter-argument to that makes morality in itself somewhat arbitrarily defined by God, that he could say, simply move the goalposts to something that, where rape, to use your example, is...
Historically, there are versions of divine-based or God-based morality which are called voluntarism, which are subject to this feature.
Yeah,
William Ockham, for example, thought that God just made up what moral values there are, and that therefore moral values are rooted in the will of God, and hence the name voluntarism. But the vast majority of theists have not held that view. In fact, I don't know of any contemporary theistic philosopher who is a voluntarist. Instead, what those of us who are advocating divine command morality hold is that the moral good is not rooted in God's will, it's rooted in His nature. That God is essentially fair, kind, compassionate, and so forth. And it's impossible for Him to have been otherwise. As a being which is worthy of worship, as a being which is maximally great, God has these essential properties. And these properties, or this nature, is then expressed to us in the form of divine commands, which constitute our duties. So our duties are rooted in His commands, but His commands are not arbitrary. They're not rooted in His will, they're rooted in His nature. And I think that completely evacuates the arbitrariness objection of any force.
May I also quickly ask, you use modality in the case of your modal form of the ontological argument for the existence of God, but you also reject any kind of multiverse. Do you find that at all at odds, particularly in the context of David Lewis, the popularizer of modality, who definitely believed something similar to multiverse theory?
Yes, boy, Lewis came up yesterday in our physics conference as well.
Excellent.
Let me explain the question.
We can go back to you first.
When I use modal logic, this is the logic of the possible and the necessary. For example, here we've argued that it's possible that such a being exists, and therefore it follows that he does exist. Now, when I talk about a multiverse and argue against that, I'm not talking about mere possibilities. People who hold to the multiverse or the world ensemble think that these other parallel worlds really exist, that these are other concrete space-times, and that they're out there. They're really out there. And I gave my arguments against that world ensemble hypothesis. That's completely different from modality, which merely concerns possibilities, not concrete realities. Now, the qualifier comes with respect to the late Princeton philosopher David Lewis, who thought that modality was about other concrete realities. He held that these other possible worlds are other space-times, like the multiverse. They're really out there. And he thought this just on the basis of possibility and necessity. He was what's called a modal realist. But almost everyone rejects this view as science fiction. If there are other universes out there, it's to astrophysics and astronomy, not philosophy, that we should turn in order to discover whether or not they're there. Indeed, Lewis's view of modality has some really counterintuitive consequences, and here's just one of them. On his view, it means that I could not possibly have had one hair less on my head or one molecule less in my body. Why? Because in that other world where I have one less molecule or one less hair, that's not me. That's what he calls a counterpart of Bill Craig. But Bill Craig only exists in the actual world. Bill Craig is not that counterpart that exists in that other world. And therefore, I couldn't possibly have been different, which is crazy. That means that everything that is necessarily, which really makes modality just collapse. So I think Lewis's view is just completely wrong, and we shouldn't be distracted by it.
We're going to take one, and
Yes.
then two there, third person there, fourth and fifth. One question each this time, I'm afraid. Sorry, that's not a criticism, but here you go.
All right, my question's on the origin of the universe.
Okay, good.
So the Big Bang, the idea of the Big Bang is that it explodes out from a singularity,
Yes,
And,
on the standard model.
and the singularity has no space, so
Right.
there's no space, there's no time. Speaking
Right.
of space-time, so aren't words like cause and begin, aren't those inappropriate? In terms, it's kind of like asking, where's the beginning of a circle?
Okay. Well, now, it's not like the beginning of a circle. In the standard model, if we let three-dimensional space be represented by this disk, then as you go back in time, space contracts down to a point before which it does not exist. And that is the point of the initial cosmological singularity, about 13.7 billion years ago. It represents the origin of all matter and energy, of physical space and time themselves. And it's perfectly coherent to speak, as cosmologists do, of the beginning of time, or the beginning of the universe. To say that the universe begins to exist is to say that the universe exists at, well, we call the singularity t equals 0. The universe exists at t equals 0, and there is no time prior to the singularity at which the universe exists. And that's a perfectly coherent concept, and indeed what most cosmologists believe. What you cannot say is that the universe exists at t equals 0, and it did not exist before t equals 0. That would imply there was a time before t equals 0 at which the universe didn't exist, and that would be incoherent. But what you can say is it exists at t equals 0, and there is no time earlier than t equals 0 at which the universe exists. So that's a perfectly coherent concept of beginning. And for the universe, for the singular point, what it represents, as you said, it's not a point of space-time. It's a boundary of space-time. It's the boundary point, like a cone, at which space-time can no longer be extended any further. And so this point is not technically in space and time, or part of space and time. It's the boundary of space and time. But it does represent the beginning of the universe. This is the point at which physical reality begins to exist. Now, in contemporary cosmology, singularities are unwelcomed by physicists, so there are attempts to get rid of these singularities, and one of the most notable of these would be the Hartle-Hawking model, propounded by Stephen Hawking, in which he proposes that as you get back to the beginning of the universe, this geometrical cone shape is rounded off rather like a shuttlecock, so that there's a sort of southern hemisphere, and the south pole of this southern hemisphere is not a singular point. It is not a boundary point. It is a point just like any other point in space-time. And so in his most recent book, The Grand Design, co-authored with Leonard Mlodinow, Hawking represents the South Pole as the beginning of time and the beginning of the universe, and then the lines of latitude will represent the progression of time. So whether you have a singular model or a non-singular model, in any case, the universe can't be extended infinitely into the past. As Vilenkin said, it's not past eternal.
So thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you, in I believe it was the second argument, you ran out an argument before you get to the empirical information. You ran out an
The
argument.
second one.
Yeah.
That's the cosmological.
Cosmological argument. Maybe it was the one before that. Anyway, you ran out this argument from infinity.
Yes,
where you
that's
argue-
this one.
That's this one. Okay. I was a bit puzzled by this. So it sounds
Right.
like you're confusing the cardinality of the set with the set itself when you're talking about infinities. So to say, for example, that we have an infinite set, let's call it A, let's say it's the natural numbers, we take away the E. So, sorry, really quickly, can you explain what your notion of infinity, of subtraction is doing?
Wait, excuse me, say again?
Can you explain your notion of subtraction, please?
I'm still not hearing you. Explain my notion of
subtraction. So what it, sorry.
subtraction?
Of subtraction. So what does it mean to take away? You've got two infinite sets.
Yeah.
You want to define, how is subtraction defined?
Well, it would be defined just as it is in ordinary arithmetic. You take away one quantity from another quantity, which leaves the remainder. I forget the exact name. Is it the diminuend from the subtrahend and this? I forget the technical terms for it. And then you have the quantity which is left as a result. So it's a quite ordinary concept of subtraction. There's nothing mysterious about it.
Okay, and so then my concern is simply this. So if you have an infinite set, and to take away two things from two different kinds of infinite sets, there's no problem there, at least according to contemporary ZFC,
Well,
with getting some of them coming out as finite, some of the residues coming out as finite, and other residues coming out as infinite.
well, no, that's not quite right. In infinite set theory or transfinite arithmetic, you're not permitted to do inverse operations like subtraction and division with transfinite numbers. So take the set of natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. As you say, the cardinal number of this is aleph null, which is the first transfinite number. And if you try to do subtraction with this, what is aleph null minus aleph null? You don't have any consistent answer. It can be anything from 0 to infinity. So as a result, in transfinite arithmetic, these sorts of operations are simply prohibited. They're against the rules. But my point is that while that may work on paper in the realm of mathematics, in the real world, you can't prevent someone from giving away half his coins, or all the odd-numbered coins, or giving away all the coins greater than 1, 2, 3. So that while you can prevent these sorts of situations in mathematics by slapping the hand of the mathematician who tries to do inverse operations with these numbers, you can't do that in reality. So nothing I've said is an attack upon Cantorian set theory, or transfinite arithmetic, or classical mathematics. My only claim is that what David Hilbert said, he was a champion of the actual infinite, but he said it doesn't exist in the real concrete world of people and coins and eggs and things like that, because then you get these and many, many other very bizarre sorts of consequences.
Bill, can I just check, you'd be happy to take some of these questions further with people afterwards if they wish to
Yes,
ask the question?
yes.
Yeah, excellent.
All this stuff about time is getting me rather confused, so I'm going to go
Okay, I don't see where. Ah, there you are, okay.
to the resurrection of Christ. I'm just a simple quantum student, deal with infinity.
Don't make excuses for yourself.
Well, I do have a question about time, but I'll go there. So, one of the things that you're talking about was the origin of this set was belief in his resurrection.
Yes.
The fervor that came out of a culture that didn't necessarily believe in resurrection. Isn't there explanations similar to this in other religions? For the main example, for example, being Islam, where people are also equally willing to go to their death for something that seems slightly implausible. Particularly Muhammad coming to this grand conclusion and attacking the culture of his time in a way that didn't necessarily guarantee success. And then that sort of rips into the rest of this logic because you have other people who are willing to go to those extremes.
All right. It's very important that we understand this argument, or otherwise we'll misconstrue it. The argument is not at all that because of the fervor of the original disciples, that therefore what they said is true. That would be obviously mistaken. Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, all sorts of other groups have been willing to die for their beliefs that they hold to be true. So there's nothing in this argument that says they sincerely believed that they were willing to die, therefore it must have been true. No, no. All this is saying this is one of the facts about the early Christian movement that the historian needs to explain. How do you explain things like the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the fact that these earliest disciples sincerely came to believe in Jesus' resurrection. And then you can look at these alternative theories. And I think one of the weaknesses in the conspiracy theory would be that it can't explain very well the evident sincerity and transformation in the first disciples. They at least sincerely believed what they were proclaiming, and therefore this would go against the conspiracy theory. So the argument isn't meant to prove the resurrection of Jesus directly. It's simply to say this is one of the facts that the historian needs to account for. And I referred to Professor N.T. Wright a moment ago. He has written a 700-page book, which is the most lengthy and erudite defense of that third point. That book is essentially an argument based upon that point of how you best explain the origin of the disciples' belief that Jesus is risen from the dead. And he argues that the only way to explain that plausibly is that they actually encountered an empty tomb, actually saw these post-mortem appearances. So he hinges the other two beliefs on that one. So I certainly wouldn't claim that just because someone is willing to die for his beliefs, that therefore that belief is true. Not at all. I think that at best that goes to show he's sincere rather than a conspirator.
But while you have to prove the fervor that they have in the resurrection of Christ, because it exists historically.
Say again, louder.
Because you do have to explain the fervor that exists historically, because it does exist historically, but equally other religions are as sincere in their beliefs historically.
Right, that's fine. So any account, let's take Mormonism. Any account of Mormonism is going to have to account for the fact that these early people sincerely believed and followed Joseph Smith and did what he said. You couldn't say, for example, that this is the product of a long period of legendary and mythological development around a mythical figure named Joseph Smith who never really existed, for example. And so that point that these original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe in Jesus' resurrection would be really impossible to explain by any theory that suggested that belief in Jesus' resurrection was not an early belief, but was the later product of, say, Pauline theology or later church beliefs that evolved decades after Jesus was gone and dead. You see what I mean? That would be incompatible with that third fact. You couldn't explain the fact of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection by this late developing legend hypothesis, which was once widely held by New Testament scholars in the 19th century, early 20th century, when they were still trying to date the Gospels as late documents in the 2nd century after Christ rather than 1st century documents. And those kind of late developing legend theories simply can't account for this fact. Neither can conspiracy theories, which suggest that it's a lie rather than a sincere belief that they have. So I'm still simply saying that this is a historical fact that any acceptable hypothesis has to come to grips with, and certain hypotheses will have trouble doing that, like the late developing legend hypothesis or the conspiracy hypothesis.
I think we've got time for about 3 more. So 1 to 2, and then the third one there, and we'll see how we get on time-wise after that. Okay.
Okay, I've lots of questions, so I'll think more. I want to take you back to the cosmological argument and the evidence you seem to adduce for a beginning from contemporary cosmology.
William, I'm going to need you to speak more loudly. I know you're a soft-spoken guy, but...
So back to the cosmological argument, the evidence you seek to adduce for a beginning from contemporary cosmology. Our current Big Bang theory really breaks down when we extrapolate too far into the past. We reach singularities, someone's already observed.
Yes.
As you observe, physics doesn't like singularities. But when we get a working quantum theory of gravity, which is what we need. It is entirely possible that Big Bang evidence for a beginning will evaporate. So I wonder if it is wise to make theistic inferences about a beginning on the basis of a theory that's known to be unsatisfactory, precisely that part of our history where that theory is known to be unsatisfactory.
Okay, William, you're going to love this answer. The problem that William points out here is that the Big Bang theory is based upon the general theory of relativity. But when we get back to around 10 to the negative 43 seconds after the Big Bang, which is the so-called Planck time, general relativity theory breaks down. And we need to marry it with quantum physics to have a quantum theory of gravitation. And the problem is that we don't have a quantum theory of gravitation, and so we're not sure how to describe this earliest phase of the universe. But, William, here's the really interesting thing. The Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is independent of your physical description of this early era. It doesn't presuppose anything about your theory of gravity. So that whatever sort of theory of gravity you have to develop or to describe this early era, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem will hold of it. So that is one of the most powerful things about it, is its sweeping generality. It doesn't depend upon our having a physical description of this first split second of the universe. So these alternative models that Vilenkin talks about include all sorts of other quantum gravitational models. String scenarios, pre-Big Bang cosmologies, loop quantum gravity, all sorts of these other models. And the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is going to have a consequence that the universe is still not extrapolable to past infinity. It still began to exist. And so I think we're on good grounds in saying, as Vilenkin did, that the universe did in fact begin to exist at some time in the finite past.
Okay.
Your first 6 arguments demonstrate that apart from the Christian God, basically nothing else works as an explanation for the way we see the world. We're kind of useful for that. I'm most interested in your 7th point about personal experience. Because I mean, if someone is just purely reasoned intellectually into Christianity, then they can be intellectually reasoned out of Christianity. For the same way, but you've previously said in the past on YouTube clips, etc., that the proof to the Christian that the Christian God exists is the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit.
That is what I'm talking about in premise 2. You're quite right. It is what in the New Testament the Apostle Paul calls the inner witness of the Spirit.
Now, I don't think that anybody can, unless you believe what the apostles in the New Testament believe, you'll never experience what they experience. So perhaps you could share something about how you personally experienced the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. Oh, that's so convincing.
All right. Well, this would probably be a good note on which to close our evening with this last point. I myself wasn't raised in a Christian home or even a church-going family. And I felt deeply the darkness and the despair that I later learned existentialist philosophers describe of a life that is meaningless, purposeless, and ultimately valueless. And when I became a teenager, I began to ask these kinds of questions. Why do I exist? Why am I here? Where am I going? And in the search for answers, I started attending, all on my own, a large church in our community. Only problem was, instead of answers, all I found was a sort of social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate, and the other high school students who went to the youth group and church on Sunday and pretended to be such good Christians lived for their real God the rest of the week, which was popularity. And they would climb over each other's backs, do anything in order to be popular. And I thought, something's terribly, terribly wrong here. I'm living a better life than they are externally, and yet I feel so empty inside, spiritually. They must be just as empty as I am. But they're all putting on this false front. They're all a pack of hypocrites, pretending to be something they're not. And so I began to grow very bitter toward the people in the institutional church. I thought they're all a bunch of phonies. They're all hypocrites. And they're not real, authentic people. And pretty soon this attitude began to spread toward other people. And I began to look at others and say they're all phonies. No one's really genuine. Everybody's holding up a plastic mask to the world, and the real person is cowering down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And so I began to hate other people because of the phoniness and the inauthenticity that I saw. And I was on my way, frankly, toward becoming a very alienated young man. I threw myself into my studies because I could find solace there. And I said, I don't need people. I don't want people. I don't need to be with them. I hate them. And I just threw myself into my studies and shunned them. And yet, at the same time, in moments of introspection and honesty, I knew that deep down inside, I really did want to love and to be loved by others, and that I really did need people, after all. And I realized in that moment that I was just as much a phony as they were. That I was putting up this false mask of bravado, pretending not to need or want other people when I really did. And so that anger that I felt toward others turned in on myself because of my own phoniness and hypocrisy. And I don't know if you understand what this is like, but this kind of inner anger just eats away at your insides day after day, making every day miserable, another day to get through. And I remember one day I was feeling particularly crummy. I walked into my high school German class, and I sat down behind a girl who was one of these types, you know, that is always so happy, it just makes you sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around, and I said to her, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, well, Bill, it's because I'm saved. And I said, what? And she said, I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was, so filled with anger and hate inside. And she said there was someone who really loved me. And who was it but the God of the universe? And that thought just staggered me, to think that the God of the universe could love me, Bill Craig, that worm down there on that infinitesimal speck of dust called planet Earth. And I just couldn't take it in. Well, I went home that night, and I found a New Testament that had been given to me by the Gideons in the 5th grade, which I'd never read, and I opened it and I began to read the Gospels. And as I did so, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. This man's teaching had a wisdom about it that I had never encountered before. And there was an authenticity about his life that wasn't characteristic of these people who claimed to be his followers in that local church I was attending. And I realized then I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so I devoured the New Testament. I read it from cover to cover. Sandy introduced me to other Christians in the high school. I had never met people like this. It was as though they were in touch with a different plane of reality than I was. A reality that imparted a deep peace and meaning to their lives that I really craved. And I realized in reading the New Testament what my problem was. My own moral failures and shortcomings had separated me from the relationship with God that I was created to have. And that's why God seems so unreal and distant from me. But the good news of the gospel was that he had sent his son, Jesus Christ, into the world to bear the penalty for my moral failures and sins so that I could be forgiven and cleansed and restored to this relationship. And so after about 6 months of the most intense soul searching that I've ever been through in my life, I just came to the end of my rope and I cried out to God. And as I did so, I cried out all of the anger, the bitterness that had been building up inside of me. And I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And I remember I rushed outside. It was a warm September Midwestern evening. And as I looked up at the sky, I could see the stars, the Milky Way, from horizon to horizon. And as I looked up at the stars, I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my entire life. Because I realized that if this message were really the truth, if it were really the truth, then I could do nothing less than devote my entire life to sharing this good news among mankind. Because this is the greatest news ever announced. And so that's really why I'm here in St. Andrews, is because I love to share the good news of this message that so changed my life, and I believe can change anyone's life here tonight who hasn't yet found God in the way that I've described here as an immediate, personal reality in your life. And if you're searching for God and haven't yet found Him in this way, I'd encourage you to do what I did. Pick up a New Testament, begin to read it, and ask yourself, could this really be the truth? Could there really be a God who exists, who loves me and sent His Son Jesus Christ for me? I believe that the evidence makes this a very credible worldview. That if you were to make this sort of step, you don't put your brain on the shelf in order to do it, but you're moving in line with what reason and evidence suggest. And so I would urge you to consider this. Begin to pray and ask God, if you're there, show yourself to me. And I believe it could change your life in the same way that it changed mine.
Thank you so much for coming. If you're like me, your brain is hurting at least a little bit after some of that. I know that Bill is delighted to take more questions, and I'm sure many of you will have more. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of them, but please ask him now, pin him down before he leaves town tomorrow morning. And if you have further questions, unresolved issues that you have, then there's also the resource of Bill's website, reasonablefaith.org, and a lot of these issues and questions are addressed there. So thank you very much for coming this evening.